Has it loaded?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we shall be discussing the paper titled Housing and Dishousing in Mumbai, a historical outline of slum discourse and policy by Hussain Indorwala. British Member of Parliament Samuel Pepys famously referred to Mumbai as a poor little island when the East India Company acquired it from the Portuguese for an annual fee of £10 in 1668. Proving his statement to be terribly wrong, it eventually emerged as the Urbs Prima in Indis, aka the first city in India. Over time, the city saw aspirations of not just the colonizers but also merchants, traders, and migrants who came here in search of work. Soon, it transformed from a mere trading town to a bustling industrial hub. Growing population and migration come hand in hand with growing prosperity, and the dearth of place to live in soon became prominent. Urban development in Mumbai has two main facets. The first concern being the city's social policy, an aim to improve the infrastructure and to provide proper homes equipped with proper sanitation for all the citizens. While the second one focuses on the ambition of making the city a leading hub of the nation's industrial and commercial activities. It has been observed time and again that the second policy is given way more importance than the first. However, from the later part of the 19th century, there were attempts made to improve the living conditions of the citizens as the authorities tried several methods adopted by other cities such as Glasgow, Paris, New York, etc., with the aim of achieving a world class status. The paper in discussion traces this timeline. The plague of 1896 was crucial and clearly acted as a catalyst to urge the authorities to take note of the insanitary dwelling conditions that existed in large parts of the city, which quite naturally had aggravated the infection, spreading it among more people. The British ended up reshaping the city after the devastations caused by the plague. In November 1898, the Bombay City Improvement Trust (BCIT) was formed. What happened next is famous as the Glasgow phase in the urban development of Mumbai, then Bombay. Glasgow in 1868 was in the midst of the largest population boom in its history. The size of the city had quadrupled twice and its population had reached its peak. Alongside this, the influx of migrants caused the demand for housing to increase beyond all possible supply. Dwelling for the working class of Glasgow during that time was essentially just one room used as a separate house, frequently being subdivided by insubstantial partitions. Sometimes access to this kind of a house was provided by a brick built staircase tacked on to the back of the building. Needless to say, the conditions of living were very poor, with no supply of adequate light or ventilation, and soon change was brought about. The slums of Bombay had similar living standards, and so the BCIT decided to activate a scheme modeled with keeping the 19th century Glasgow Improvement Trust in mind. Instead of a well planned, measured scheme, it started off by randomly clearing residential and commercial areas to make way for large east west boulevards such as Princess Street at Marine Lines and Sandhurst Road. The construction of sanitary dwellings with a proper supply of water, air, and light became sidelined yet again. It seemed to be a rip-off version of the Glasgow Improvement Policy. New houses with a standard of light and ventilation, advocating that every living room must have a minimum external space that would allow light to fall at a specific angle of 63.5 degrees, were built, yes, but in comparison to the number of dwellings demolished, the number of new ones provided was much less. By 1919, the trust had demolished 24,428 houses and constructed only 21,387. A huge majority of Bombay's population was already residing in single room tenements at that time. The unbridled demolition rendered many people homeless and they migrated to other parts of the city, making those areas overcrowded. In the later half of this phase, BCIT began suburban expansion and the creation of new building sites in the northern peripheries. With the aim of relieving congestion in the overcrowded areas of the city. They brought villages in as sites to build the new updated tenements and called them the suburbs. This legitimized clearance and made way for the so-called resettlement for planned development. Eventually, the failure of the Glasgow phase caused BCIT to get dissolved and ultimately become a part of the corporation itself. Path is going to take over now.
Till the early post-independent decades, chawls remained a form of low-cost dwelling for the city's working poor. There were three types of single-family dwelling houses that extended vertically and horizontally over time to become 4 to 5 story tenement blocks. These were described as the most insanitary buildings in the city, with little light and air, narrow passages between the buildings. Tenement blocks built by private enterprise for profit with toilets and water connections. And the third were buildings erected by the Improvement Trust and other public bodies on sanitary lines that were insensitive to the preferences of the inhabitants. Almost all housings for the laboring classes, except ones built by the public bodies, were reported to be grievously in. Next slide. In these early decades, informal settlements were referred to as hutment colonies or patpattis. In 1956, a municipal corporation undertook a detailed survey and identified three types of. First were the permanent and multi-storied buildings with outdated sanitary and living standards, which were the city and the industrial areas. The second were semi-permanent residential buildings that deteriorated because of the structural and sanitary conditions. These were in the suburbs of the city. The third were the unauthorized and insanitary huts put up by vagrants and homeless population on vacant lands. Stated that the main problem was with respect to the first two types, since the hutments were less in number at that time. Next slide. The BMC's powers to undertake slum clearance were expanded with an to the BMC Act in 1954 to stop and remove unlawful buildings and or works. This empowered BMC to declare an area a clearance area that could be secured either by ordering the demolition of buildings or through the acquisition of the area. In 1958, the large-scale evictions in Bombay were carried out when 4,000 families were displaced from various parts of the city to the city's periphery. In the late 1960s, the Deputy Prime Minister of the country, Morarji Desai, relocated more hutmen's dwellers from the island city to the eastern suburbs. Yeah, next slide.
The New York case. In 1969, BMC set up a slum improvement policy which spent 8.5 million for the improvement of 200 slum pockets. But at this stage, only informal settlements were considered slums. Other buildings with overcrowding and sanitation issues were still just known as dilapidated buildings. The Slum Act of 1971 changed this via declaring a slum area if it may be a harm to health and might not be habitable for living. Then came the Vacant Land Act, which considered all the land used by informal settlers as vacant. It was during the emergency that the first census of hutment dwellers took place, and 6,30,003 houses were made legitimate by providing photo passes. A huge number of people were evicted after this and sent back to their native place if they do not possess the pass. 70,000 people from Janta Colony were evicted for housing officials and scientists in the area. Next slide. From 1975 to 1980, the fifth five-year plan changed the government's role from being the direct provider of low-income housing to a facilitator via self-help housing, which failed, due to which the World Bank assisted the self-help housing scheme by a project of 282 crore called the Bombay Urban Development Project. This project consisted of two programs, the Slum Upgradation Program and Low Income Shelter Program. Instead of giving subsidies to apartment housing, the BUDP now wanted to give out a large number of service plots at a very low cost. This helped in full cost recovery and replication of this program by the private sectors. The World Bank also changed strategies by classifying an area a slum area not on the basis of condition but on the basis of its origin, whether it is legal or illegal. This also helped in creating a sense of insecurity and lesser investments in the illegal housing. The program succeeded in selling 87,743 service plots to low-income households and benefit of slum upgradation was given to 22,204 households. Objectives were achieved by the program as the public sector investment downsized and private supply was on the rise. The problem was that only those households that were enumerated in 1976 to 1980 were eligible, and others that came later were left out. Next slide. In the first development plan laid in 1964, which was planned on the basis of 7.06 million population, an anticipated housing supply was around 50,000. These were to be built by State Housing Board, the public sector agencies, and cooperatives, whereas the private sector was considered not very reliable. But due to inefficiency, not even half of the housing supply was met. With the private sector not focusing on the informal housing and the public sector not able to supply housing, a lot more amount of informal settlements came in. Around 45,000 informal settlements were provided every year, and around 44.6% population of Mumbai was living under informal settlements. The whole issue of slums was now solely in the hands of politicians, who then decided whether the area was legal or illegal. Next.
The Singapore phase. Redevelopment with an increased floor space index, which is the FSI, began to become established for informal settlements in the mid 1980s. The project was focused on Dharavi and aimed to provide new infrastructure and redevelopment housing for beneficiaries in the form of cooperatively owned walk-up apartment blocks. The 1990s saw the coming of the enabling market strategy that was in line with the broader shifts in the development policy around the world. According to this strategy, housing was to be reconceived as an economic and not as a public good.
Now redevelopment instead of upgradation was taken up. The SRD scheme promised to double the FSI and provide 18 square meter minimum land for dwellers. Only 40% of the cost was supposed to be contributed by the beneficiaries, and the rest was supposed to be financed from the leftover land after rehabilitation. In 1995, next slide, Vidisha. In 1995, during the Shiv Sena BJP alliance, a campaign to provide free housing was promised. The SRA scheme was set up by Slum Rehabilitation Authority (SRA). The logic of redevelopment was pushed further by increasing minimum area for housing to 21 square meter, and a full cross subsidy was given to the dwellers. But this project failed to materialize, and only 1,57,402 units were produced. In 1990s, a large number of evictions, around 500 each day, took place. Also with liberalization coming in, the middle class could directly contact the judiciary against the informal housing. NGOs and groups like Bombay Environmental Action Group filed PILs against encroachments in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, PILs against hutments along railway lines were also filed. Even PILs regarding the informal settlements being the vote banks to politicians were filed, where they suggested that the revision of electoral lists was supposed to be taken by deleting all the names of the encroachers. Next.
The Shanghai phase. In the early years of new millennium, that is in the early 2000s, India's Prime Minister accepted McKinsey's recommendation on restructuring Mumbai. The actual motive was to transform Mumbai and make it a better city than Shanghai, which was a talking point at that time. This affected the informal settlements a lot. Between November 2004 and February 2005, state government and municipal corporation bulldozed 80,000 to 94,000 homes and over 44 localities. At that time, 124 hectares of land was cleared, out of which 140 acres fell under the no development zone. However, after the demolition phase, people went back to their lands and rebuilt their homes. In the priority list, next slide. In the priority list of Mumbai transformation agenda, there were the infrastructure projects for new railways, flyovers, highways and link roads. The two projects, Mumbai Urban Transport Project and Mumbai Urban Infrastructure Project, displaced thousands of hutman dwellers. MUTP displaced 19,847 households, which was the largest displacement caused in India at that time. The total households displaced by MUTP and MUIP together were 25,000 households.
It was also estimated that metro rail projects and airport modernization project will result in displacement of 136,000 households, which will be the largest forced relocation. The MMRDA agency constructed rehabilitation blocks for displaced dwellers in a state which sponsored high-rise housing construction. Hence, the state government, as a compensation, could raise 42% of the project cost by offering TDR to landowners instead of money. Next slide. The ambition of world-class Mumbai was a desire of city officials, managers, and magnates to create and maintain the city as a leading industrial and commercial properties and planning ideology center. Consequent shifts in land and development policy and macroeconomic reforms transformed shelter strategy for dwellers. The public policy is focused on developing means for private sector to achieve their goals to make cities slum-free. Government considers interests of landowners and developers who take up these resettlement projects like SRA schemes, which still persist the inequality. The public land used in such schemes are alienated to private developers for redevelopment and resettlement. Economic factor plays an important role over here, as it is decided on the basis of economic relations where and in what manner the city's poor will reside. So, after this discussion, we can conclude by saying that that even there that even after having that there have been attempts to provide the basic clean and sanitary dwelling for the working class of the city. Somehow, they have been always overshadowed by development in other frontiers. Mumbai is now a leading commercial and industrial hub. It is one of the leading metropolitan cities of the nation. Some might even call it world class. Over the centuries of progress, not much has changed for the working class. Thank you. Yeah, we're done.
Okay, anybody has any questions for the presenters? Any comments? Okay, so yeah, somebody was saying something. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Somebody was saying something. No? Okay. So this essay is mainly a kind of a historical overview. Not so much of it definitely talks about slum policy, but what is more important about this, there are a few arguments that are made at a general level about the city's slum policy since the early 20th century. And basically what the essay is trying to do is to identify the continuities and contrasts, so certain things haven't changed, and it's important when you look at something historically to identify the things that persist and things that deviate from earlier policies or earlier approaches, which is what the main focus or the attempt of the essay is. So one thing that hasn't changed is that the condition or the position of the working class residents in the city is still, as it always was, is vulnerable and precarious and constantly subject to eviction, dispossession, and so on. Though the modes have changed, this is something that remains a feature of the city's approach to informal settlements, or to especially to working class towards working class residents. So one general point that the essay is making is that if you look at the whole history of housing policy from the early 20th century, we will find that the state actually has been more successful at demolishing houses than building them. which is actually quite a striking fact if you think about it. One important purpose of a slum policy or a housing policy is to house people, right? On the other hand, what the policies have done is more successfully dishouse them. And so what it tries to do is tries to construct the story from the beginning, more or less, right? In a way, the whole, what we know as planning in the city of Bombay was something that emerged over time, mainly began really in a systematic way with the plague. And the argument at the beginning, which was explained in the presentation, is that there was always a choice that the city had between social policy, what we call things like municipal services, healthcare, housing, and so on, things that the state provides, right? And the city's ambitions for becoming a first city of the world or of India, or whatever, urbs prima in Indus policy. So there were always these two priorities. However, the first one, or the social policy, was always subordinated to the aims of the first, of the second. However, at certain moments, as a consequence of certain kinds of crises, the city's managers, administrators, policymakers, elites, so on, recognize that social policy cannot be ignored, because if you ignore social policy, what is going to happen is that even the ambition of becoming a world-class city will suffer. So that's what happened during the plague, for instance, that a lot of workers fled the city. And if you don't have workers, you can't have production. You can't have production. You can't have profits, and you can't have, you can't create a leading industrial center. And so you realize that, well, at some point you have to give people housing, otherwise there's going to be a crisis, right? So it was in these moments of crisis that it was recognized that social policy is important, and that's when you started having certain schemes like the Bombay Improvement Trust's housing program, the Bombay Development Directorate's housing schemes, and so on. And then that became a standard practice. In fact, public housing policy was based on these early interventions. And after independence, there were concerted attempts to build public housing. In fact, the city's planning system had very rigorous constraints as to what is considered acceptable quality of housing, which had things like density norms and setback rules and FSI and so on. The idea was that sanitary housing is necessary, and if the market cannot provide this kind of sanitary housing, the state should provide it, which was very much a part of it. But however, what used to happen is that the um, the state's approach, even though in principle it was based on providing housing for the poor, more than providing housing is evicting slums in the name of clearing slums. So it was called the slum clearance scheme. However, one important part of the slum clearance scheme was that the state would clear slums but also rehouse people in sanitary housing, right? So the second part of it would very rarely be implemented. One interesting shift that you can see over time is the way in which the slums were understood. And I think this we discussed earlier in one of the classes as well, that when the first slum survey was done in 1956, when the BMC did it, it did not distinguish between informal settlements and some of the formal slums. Things like the kind of housing that you have in the inner city, which was basically built by landlords to exploit, to create more and more rental tenements and so on. Even those were classified as slums. The definition of a slum was very objective, in the sense that things like density or dilapidation or sanitation and so on. However, since the 70s, what starts happening is that more and more it's only the informal settlements that are being characterized as slums, whereas the formal housing is being spoken about as dilapidated housing or rent controlled housing and so on. So there is a kind of a different categorization of two kinds of housing. And so today, if we ask people what is a slum, you generally mean informal settlements. A lot of formal housing stock in Bombay is very slum-like. Most characteristic of that is the slum rehabilitation scheme housing, which is actually by any means of defining it, slums, but that's provided you use the classical idea of a slum, But if you talk about slums in the more contemporary usage, which is informal settlements, okay, then that's not a slum, So it's also important to recognize how terms and how categories get used and change over time. The way in which we use words change as well, and how those words change also affect how policy works or how interventions work, and and how schemes are made and so on. So since the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, there was a kind of a acceptance of informal housing as a way of the poor building for themselves and so on. But what started happening is increasingly slums started being connected to property rights violations. So a slum is basically an encroachment. That word becomes very popular after the 70s and 80s. And then you start in the 90s, you have the Shiv Sena government promising free houses for slum dwellers, very kind of popular campaign meant to win the election, which because of which they won the election in 95. And then you had to find a way of implementing this, and the way chosen to implement this was through a market oriented scheme, which is the SRA. Basically developers get incentives in the form of rehousing the amount of slum dwellers they rehouse, and that's amount of area that they get for sale and so on. And that became the standard model, and that is the model that is now being used pretty much as the default model of slum development. And the state doesn't have to spend anything for doing that kind of housing. The developers make their money, slum dwellers get the housing, so everybody seems to be happy, and that's how it's working. Except that the quality of housing and the kind of exclusions that are built into this mode of this form of housing is incredibly detrimental to the city's in terms of social policy as well as in terms of built environment, and which is what you see everywhere around you. So basically, this essay tries to sketch out this fairly broad brushed history of slum evictions and slum rehabilitation in the city. Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, then we can take it, or we can move to the next essay. No questions?
Actually, we all of us kind of have a question. So we found out why the Glasgow phase was named the Glasgow phase and why the Paris phase was named the Paris phase, but we are not sure why the New York and Singapore phases were named thus. Like, we would like to.
No. So those phases actually were not. It was not declared policy. It's just a way of kind of organizing the article. Basically, the reason why they are called these phases is because there are certain kind of parallels. So, for instance, the Shanghai phase or the New York phase is very much linked to, is basically some politician making a statement that we want to make Bombay into Shanghai, or we want to make Bombay into New York, and so on. Actually, the way it used to happen, Morarji Desai went to Paris and he thought, wow, Paris is a wonderful city. Bombay should be like Paris. So he'll come and he'll say that we'll make Bombay into a Paris if we get elected, And so then what do you do to do that? You demolish slums, Then somebody travels to New York, comes back and says, oh, we want to build Bombay like New York. And what do? They demolish slums. The same thing happens with Shanghai. You want to make Bombay into Shanghai, and you start demolishing slums. So at each stage, there is a certain kind of linkage with certain other city in the world. And that is meant to be implemented here. And the way to do that would be evictions. Now, the Glasgow phase is called that because the Bombay Improvement Trust schemes were first introduced in Glasgow in the UK. And the difference over there versus what happened here was significant. First of all, in Glasgow, when the improvement schemes were set up, the uh, the political system was a little more representative than it was here. So, for instance, in Bombay at that time, when the BIT was introduced, the amount of the percentage of population that could vote for the local government or the BMC was only about 5%. Today we have universal suffrage, so every adult can vote in the PMC elections. At that time, it was only the people who owned property or the people who paid a rent beyond a certain amount. You know, so it was a very limited suffrage, or what is called electoral representation. So if you have the only voices that are being heard in government is the landlords, you're going to have very elite oriented policies, which is what the BID essentially was. In comparison, in Glasgow, the polity was a little more representative, so it was also more oriented towards social welfare schemes and public goods and sanitation and so on, which was less intrusive and less destructive towards the poorer sections of the society. So which is why it was it is referred to as the Glasgow phase, but it was not like it was exactly the kind of improvement trusts that were set up in Glasgow. They were very colonial in that sense, and kind of bastardized versions of the improvement trust schemes which were going on in the cities of the UK. So that's why it's referred to as Glasgow scheme. Nobody ever said that we are doing what we did in Glasgow. It's simply that there were some kind of similarities to what was going on, and that's the reason why these sections are titled in this manner.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you. Like we could figure out the Glasgow and Paris one because like we knew a little about it, but then New York, like Shanghai ka bhi
New York phase mainly because this was when the World Bank came in with its aid, and World Bank headquarters is in New York. So that's the reference to New York. Reforms in Bombay's development policy were also inspired by New York. So planners or some of these advocates for development policy reform would compare Bombay to New York and say, look, Manhattan is 15 FSI, but Bombay has 1.33, which is why you have so many problems. So you make your FSI 15 and you'll solve the problems, more or less. So that's why the reference to New York. It just has to do with linking them with a certain influence elsewhere in the world.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So unless somebody else has a question, we can move on to the next piece.
I'll start with the next thing.
Yeah.
I'll present my screen. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, the paper is Against the Odds, Slum Rehabilitation in Neoliberal Mumbai. In urban India, slum policies have become increasingly reliant on the market and local self-help agencies, a trend in step with neoliberal turn across the developing world. The emphasis on local solutions is particularly interesting because the challenge of urban slums is now widely acknowledged to be one of global proportions. This paper examines the impact of this changing institutional environment on slum rehabilitation efforts in Mumbai. It provides it provides an overview of Mumbai slums and slum policies, and it presents a case study of a rehabilitation project in Ganesh Nagar D, a small community in the southern part of the city. This article this article focuses on implications of neoliberal environment on urban slum rehabilitation efforts. What new opportunities for rehabilitations are offered under neoliberal conditions? What are the constraints imposed by these conditions? How does neoliberalization affect local agencies, communities, and process in specific slum rehabilitation projects? What can we say about odds of success for various projects under condition of neoliberalization? In the relevance of neoliberalization to slum rehabilitation is in three folds. First, the shift from government intervention to reliance on the free market. and this perhaps most salient characteristic of neoliberalism is in a shift of emphasis from state planning to a reliance on market forces, partly on the basis of alleged failures of past state-led development strategies. It is argued that the free market is more likely to deliver desired results. The so-called microcredit revolution of recent years, with the involvement of major banks across the globe, is a common reflection of this transformation. The second shift is from government planning to the involvement of non-governmental organizations, or more abstractly, from state to civil society. This shift is based on two premises. First, successful development strategies demand the active participation of local communities and will otherwise fail for lack of local knowledge, a matter of efficiency. The second being the democratic ideas demand empowerment and control of development at the local level, and this in turn requires a greater role for civil society. The third principle of neoliberalism, as far as relevant to slum rehabilitation, is the shift of state responsibilities from central government to local or urban governments. In part, this is deliberate change that is in tune with the tenets of neoliberalism. Local governments thought, are thought to be better positioned to engage civil society and to respond to the market. But it is also a matter of necessity. Urban governments are increasingly forced to compete for global capital to maintain their economies and to subsidize public policies. With regard to urban slum rehabilitation, neoliberal conditions play a part at two different levels. First, they concretely affect official policies towards slum and slum rehabilitation. Second, there is an indirect impact on slums and slum rehabilitation via the recasting of local politics, prevailing ideologies, and local culture. uh, there are some common abbreviations used ahead uh, for better understanding of the presentation.
Yes, so the slum and slum policies in Mumbai. There has been a succession of government policies at various levels in Mumbai and in other large Indian cities, beginning in 1956. However, there has been never been to date a survey of a slum delivers in the urban region. The slum census of 1979 and of 1989 contain only very limited data, and the accuracy is questionable. The Government of India defines slum as housing that is unfit for human habitation or safety, health, and morals of the inhabitants. Next. The so-called Slum Clearance Plan of 1956, amended from the central government, and was mainly aimed at eradication without substantial efforts at resettlement or rehabilitation. This policy remained in effect for 15 years without any significant results, other than increased hardship for many slum dwellers. In 1971, the state of Maharashtra approved the Slum Areas Act that was aimed at improvement, clearance, and redevelopment. By this time, it had become clear that sheer eradication did not solve any problems and that efforts had to be made to upgrade or resettle slum dwellers. Next. 5 years later, in 1976, the nationwide introduction of the Urban Land Ceiling Act, that is ULCA, put limits on transaction with the declared intent to reduce land speculation and distribution land to poor. The ULCA has been under fire from left and right for having caused a decline in the land supply. Increasing prices and further housing shortages were held responsible for the failure of this program. Then there was some other policies introduced along the way, including the 1991 Slum Redevelopment Scheme, but more important changes had to wait until 1995 when liberalization was underway and real estate markets started to adjust to new times. Rehabilitation Agency, that is SRA, in this scheme, all slum buildings prior to 1995 are supposed to legalize and protect from demolition. In addition, the scheme gives an important role to the market in rehabilitation or resettlement. Next, the 1995 Slum Rehabilitation Scheme was designed and introduced at a time when economic liberalization policies were underway and were profoundly changing the urban landscape. India's liberalization policy has changed the national economy at large, but especially urban economics. For some time, Mumbai had the highest real estate values in the world, surpassing even London, New York, or Tokyo. Even today, they remain high for global standards. The main difference between the SRS and the prior policy is that the SRS employs the market and sees up to the high value of the land to allow for profitable involvement of developers and builders. Next.
The Ganesh Nagar D was a slum in G Ward in the southern half of the Greater Mumbai, which is also known as Lower Parel. It was located about 100 meters east of the railroad, just north of. It hardly covered an area of 3,008 square meters. GND was hard to find for anyone who was not area, as it was located near the rail tracks and several blocks behind the main road. In accordance to the narrative past, the slum had existed for almost 40 years. As it had a smaller and less dense population, there was no official mark of it on map, or its existence was not considered important to have in formal census or survey of paramount importance of this community. Next. Hello. Next slide. So, according to the 1995 SRS, the housing cooperative had need to attract a developer, which in turn out to be a major challenge. So, as GND had certain characteristics that played a part in the rehabilitation process. Firstly, it had relatively smaller area with the density of population living there. Second, it had the advantage of being a very close knit and consensus oriented community, where inside the slum, everybody knew everybody, individuals and families had little or no privacy, and social life and social control was intense. So the author added that it was not a place where strangers could wander in without proper introduction. So predominantly it had a long history of togetherness, and eventually they even had a long time involvement of a local NGO that helped them guide in its rehabilitation strategy. Next. The slum had one single entry, which was almost filled with pedestrian and with shops and stands all the time. As the slum had a smaller area, the in-between alleyways were quite narrow, and it mostly had single-story structures made of concrete or stone with corrugated steel roofs. The slum were noticeably below average in size without any private toilets. Next. These pictures are from the top view of the adjacent buildings, showing the GND and the adjacent slum areas. Next. So the funds for the project was provided by the SRS, the NGO. The residents who took the role of the developer, a loan was provided from the HDFC Bank, the TDR, and they sold the flats of the first three floors when they were built and used this money too for the funds. Next. This plan shows the overall design of the GND that was planned. It was to be built in three phases, and in this, the part highlighted is the phase one. Next. So, in all 390 apartments and 5 shops on the edge were to be provisioned to the slum dwellers. The sale component was reported to plan 5 shops and 20 flats on site. The new homes were designed to have 225 square feet of area with a kitchen, shower, and a toilet block, also including the balcony. They even estimated to set off 6,000 square feet of TDR that could be sold by the corporate to other developers. Next. So eventually, each family were to own their new home, which at that point of the writing was estimated to have a market value of around 8,50,000 rupees. Next.
Uh, so, uh, one major speed bump that they faced was that there was no developer that was interested in redevelopment because of the close proximity of the slums to the Arthur Road jail. There are high rises on one side and the remaining slums on the other side. The high density and a small plot put minimum requirement of 225 square feet per house into question. Um, there was also a brief period of years where they tried to include a nearby school, but that just led to further threat of court cases and trouble between the slums. And finally, the balconies were to be included in the carpet area to increase it to 225 for it to be acceptable. And since there was uh, no developer, each house had to chip in 8,000 rupees uh, to collect 30 lakhs, which was then used for the soil testing financial loan application. And it was assumed that the sales from the extra flats and the TDRs will help the residents break even uh, after they had chipped in 8,000. Next slide. So this bubble diagram is how it shows like how Ganesh Nagar D, it was this gated community which collected 30 lakhs on its own and to initiate their own redevelopment project, and they became the developers. They trusted the NGO, which is the Slum Rehabilitation Society, and they paid them. They gave them the 30 lakhs, and they applied for a financial loan. And it's no. There was like HDFC, so HDFC volunteered to give 120 lakhs, but it was a very first time where a private bank funded the slum rehabilitation, where the residents themselves were the developers, but they asked for collateral, which the GND could not provide. Once again, the NGO was acted as the most proactive player, so they got the Dutch organization Cordaid, and that Dutch organization underwrote the loan, and then HDFC granted it, and then the NGO hired the architect and the contractor. Next. So, in the end, to conclude, Jan Nijman states 5 plus points that worked in the favor of the GND, which could prove integral for the others looking to follow GND and redevelop their residency. SRS, where the residents need to capitalize on the sales of the newly uh, built homes that will finance the construction, and the entire process will be sped up by the smart sales. The government, while the central government has no greater role in this, but local and municipal governments are integral in slum dwellers approaching and claiming the right to the land on which there are slums for redevelopment. Um, I'm sorry, Danshu, could you go back to the previous slide? So I missed the point here where the government SRS scheme, where the slum rehabilitation scheme facilitated the GND to move forward, since like you needed 70% of the households on that land to petition for that land to become theirs. And over here in GND, because of the close knit community, all of the households uh, petitioned, and they got an indefinitely. Basically, they got the land for free under the slum rehabilitation scheme. Next slide. Yeah, so like I said, the government, and then the third point he states is the self help, where the slum dwellers themselves need to form a committee, a housing cooperation of trusted people, and then work forward from that. And even the logo of SRS has, like, on their website they have put like self help is the leading principle of Ganesh Nagar housing as an inspiration to others. Next slide. So then the fourth point he states is the external parties like developers, architects, builders, contractors, which have different roles according to the SRS. And uh, since GND was financed by HDFC, the dynamic changed, but others foraying into the redevelopment should take care when it comes to these external parties. And the fifth point he states is the NGOs, where the localized NGO should be contacted, since they care for the people and have a better relation and mutual respect with the locals compared to large scale NGOs. This being said, the NGO should also not be limited to the local connections, as we saw in GND's case, where a Dutch firm came out of the blue to their rescue. So the last part is this the ending statement by the author, where he says that a few words where he is really impressed by the struggle and how this is the first time something has happened, and it shows that there's significant improvement in the poor urban communities, and how Ganesh Nagar D serves as a space for hope, but still states that there's a long way to go. Next slide. So this is kind of Ganesh Nagar D now, where so the paper was written in 2008, and these events are from after that. In the early 2000s, Ganesh Nagar was on the dose, like it was creating a revolution, and it was avidly followed by mainstream media. It was discussed by the residents of various bastis, and also like a global urban studies expert like Jan Nijman had done a study on it. So if it would have gone well, it would have become the first slum self-development project in the city. But in 2010, the chairperson and the secretary were accused of alleged TDR fraud, and uh, the construction was stopped, and an investigation is going on since 10 years, and since 10 years 110 residents haven't gotten their houses, and phase 3 remains unbuilt, while phase 2 remains incomplete. And while it could have pioneered self-development across the city, residents still haven't received their flats, and a lot of them have moved away, but few continue to uh, live in makeshift settlements around, clinging onto the hope. And what is also shocking is that a lot of people are living in the unfinished phase 2 building, which still hasn't received an occupancy certificate. The implications that GND had, um, it would bring a lot of hope and make a better future for others that wanted to foray into the rehabilitation. But the case of GND highlights the lack of progress in slum rehabilitation across the city, where the slum population has continued to increase in recent years, with the space remaining almost the same. uh, it appears that in Mumbai's current slum rehabilitation schemes, too much is expected of the market, where developers are only interested in the most lucrative projects, and most slum rehabilitation projects return relatively modest or no profit at all. And most groups of slum dwellers will not be able to replicate the endeavors of GND, because they are not closed in communities like GND was, and urban land and finance markets will always not be able to deliver a large scale solution like HDFC was able to. Around the year where Ganesh Nagar D was reaching completion in 2007, the government had another strategy where it invited bids from all around the world for large scale development plans of Dharavi. And this project would have involved hundreds of thousands of people and large areas in the very well in the topographical center of Greater Mumbai. But again, the author's take on this is that this project would put control firmly in the hands of big development corporations, presumably linked with the government, and most likely with very little or no say for the slum dwellers at all. Uh, yeah, next slide. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so let's start with a question for people who not the people who presented, but maybe the rest of the class. Can anybody tell us about what is meant by the term neoliberalism? Anyone? No marks for right or wrong answers. This is just I mean, it's a free discussion.
Did we privatization of
Okay.
things?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's one way of understanding it. But yeah, but what does it mean? What does privatization mean?
Promoting capitalism and reduce and broadly and not using public
So
government provided.
Why is it done, and what is the problem with that? What are the arguments for neoliberalism?
I think problems would be that it's not available to large section of the population. I mean, if things are privatized, then it becomes only available for people who can financially.
Sure, but what are the arguments for people who are for privatization? Obviously, they have arguments, right? They are not just doing it because.
Yeah. I'll have to think.
Actually, that should be easier to answer because there's a lot of pro-privatization talk everywhere, and it's more difficult to find arguments against privatization. I mean, if you listen to the news, if you read the newspapers, it's all about why privatization is so wonderful. Anybody? So, for instance, that, the government is thinking very seriously about disinvesting from many of the public sector, disinvesting many of the public sector enterprises, right? Whether it's the state banks or state industries, telecom, this, that, and the other, shipping, resource exploitation. Why are they doing it? What are they saying in order to get people to accept privatization? What is the advantage of disinvesting, privatizing? Nobody has an answer to this. It's very surprising.
Better management.
Yeah. Go ahead. I think there are two people speaking. One at a time, please. Anybody can go. Just start talking.
Better management and efficiency.
Okay, management and efficiency. Yes, that is something that they say all the time. That private sector is more efficient, public sector is inefficient. Private sector has better management practices, public sector has poor management practices. Yes, that is the case. What do you achieve by better efficiency? Why is it important to be efficient?
Better economy.
Okay, yeah. Better efficiency leads to better growth rates, let's say, more profits, which means the country is apparently doing better if firms are profitable and so on. All right. Any other justifications for privatization? Efficiency.
There's also, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's also this argument of capitalism breeds innovation. Like this, if there's more competition, they'll make it more efficient.
Right. So it's the idea is that if when firms are in competition with one another, they try to innovate, they try to outdo each other, which has essentially beneficial effects because everybody is going to try to produce the best that they can, and so people have more choice and and better prices for the choices that are available, because they're also trying to compete at the level of prices, like they're trying to compete at the level of technology and so on, right? So these are the standard kind of arguments for privatization, handing over large sectors of the economy to the private sector, because private sector is considered to be more efficient. And I mean, we know this characterization of government bureaucracies as being corrupt and inefficient and rent-seeking and babus and all of that, typical kind of uh, largely stereotypical views that one has about government enterprises, right? And that really is the reason why a lot of people believe that government is inherently inefficient and a bad way of doing things, and therefore the neoliberal view says that government should do only very few things, and things like, for instance, enforcing law and order, or enforcing private property rights, police and military, and those are the things that the government should do. And other than that, they should leave things to the private sector. One could argue, why is the government more efficient at handling the police? Maybe that is better privatized, or the military, maybe that is also privatized, or the prison system, maybe you want to privatize that as well, because if efficiency is the sole metric for deciding what is good and what is not, then why should the government do that, right? But even the most staunchest neoliberal advocate recognizes that there is the capitalism is quite heavily dependent on state power and coercion in order for it to function, because if you don't enforce, say, property rights and things like that, then it's very difficult to have an environment where capitalism can function, right? So what the capitalists or the neoliberal advocates say is that the state should simply be the kind of a referee and maybe set the rules of the game. Actually, the state should not even set the rules of the game. The state should ask the players what rules of the game they should set, and they should do that and enforce the rules. So if somebody steps out of line, you kind of discipline them and so on. But the game should be played according to only by market players, not by the state. Now, this is essentially the neoliberal view. And there are a whole range of arguments about that. One is that markets are better at allocating goods and services to people. Why? Because if you put a price on things, people value it better. That's one argument. The argument is that if you get the right kind of prices for things, then there is less scope for people to bureaucracies or middlemen to control things and rent seek and so on. So there are a whole range of those kinds of arguments. So basically, neoliberalism is the view that the best way of organizing society is that most of the decisions about production and distribution should be left to the marketplace. Now, that's the standard view of neoliberalism. And in this essay, Jan Nijman's essay, he's talking about, okay, this is what neoliberalism is supposed to be. Neoliberalism is supposed to be the rule of markets and the rule of private sector players who will produce housing in the marketplace, and then people will be able to, and I mean, the idea is that if there is a demand in the marketplace, there will be somebody who will step in to provide it, right? So, for instance, if most people want low-income housing, the market will find a way of providing it. How? God knows, but it will. So you do tend to have lots of new firms and new kinds of entrepreneurs who are coming up with ideas like microfinance or microcredit. Then you have different kind of entrepreneurs who are coming up with low-cost housing solutions and so on. We have some ex-students who are now doing some research on using garbage to make building blocks so that you can provide housing with at I don't know, at 20% less cost than standard building materials and so on. So all of this innovation that is taking place in thinking about the kind of demands that are there in society, right? So that's the neoliberal view. Now, what Jan Nijman is looking at is this case of slum rehabilitation in Bombay. And he says that, look, yeah, okay, it is not state-built housing, because public housing is when the state builds finances housing and gets maybe some contractor to build it or whatever, but the state owns the land, it owns the housing, it may give it to the give it on ownership to the person and make a society like MHADA does, but it's still the whole thing, the whole project is authored by the state, you know. And the management says that, of course, slum rehabilitation policy is not like that. It is market based in the sense that the land is handed over to the developer, and then the developer builds, rehabilitates, and the developer builds sale and so on. However, in the Slum Rehabilitation Act, there is a provision where slum dwellers can undertake self-development. Okay, and they have a small kind of a package of incentives if that happens. However, there is not a single case of self-building by slum dwellers, and there are, I mean, very good reasons for that. One of them is that taking up a project of this scale requires lots of things. Mainly, it requires capital, you know, and the ability of slum dwellers to borrow such a large amount of money for a venture like this is going to be very difficult. No bank is going to risk that paying, you know, giving that kind of financing, and people are going to be worried about, you know, even people who might get housing through the project might be worried whether it will go through or not. So so it becomes difficult for slum dwellers to do it themselves, which is when an NGO steps in, like the Slum Rehabilitation Society. Slum Rehabilitation Society was founded by this guy called Adolf Tagler, who passed away. I mean, very genuine, sincere man. And they did one project with in Bandra in collaboration with the church and all that, which was a nice project. But other than that, they have, I mean, very little has materialized. Even Ganesh Nagar didn't work out, as you guys pointed out. And so the slum rehabilitation scheme has a provision, but obviously it is very difficult or almost impossible for slum dwellers to do their own self-development. But the one interesting thing about slum redevelopment policy in Bombay is that it potentially makes everyone a developer. You know, I mean, even if you're a squatter, you're potentially a developer. If you can figure out a way of making a project, you can become a developer, you know, and because you also have a lot of incentives. So if you take up a slum redevelopment scheme, even as a group of slum dwellers, you have the kind of FSI and the TDR access to all of that. And so you may find it very difficult to borrow money to initiate the scheme, but if the scheme goes through, if somebody can trust you and give you that kind of money, then you stand to make a lot of profits, right? So so that kind of capital obviously only builders have, developers have, and so that's why most slum redevelopment schemes are undertaken by developers, not by local players, you know, or even residents for that matter. So in this situation, then the NGO becomes an important nodal agency, and they're professionals and they know how to deal with money, and you know, banks or financiers can trust them. That's the reason why HDFC gave the loan to SRS, and the project kind of went through and so on. It got stuck later, but at least it reached a stage which wouldn't have reached, right? Otherwise wouldn't have reached. So Jan Nijman is asking, if this is neoliberalism, it looks nothing like neoliberalism. It's something very different. You know, there are all of these multiple agencies involved. It's not only state, it's not only, you know, developers doing things. And so he's saying that, look, it's a little more complicated than neoliberalism, at least the textbook version of neoliberalism. So what is it? And is it possible for slum dwellers to find, to do their own development in a neoliberal situation? And he seems to think that yes, it is. However, as you all know, and as the presentation said, that it might have been possible, but there are very, very few or almost no examples of this kind of scheme being able to work out. In fact, some of my friends who you know, activist friends who have attempted these things, they say that actually the SRA itself makes it very difficult for any such scheme to go through, because they want these kind of schemes to be done mainly by developers. So they are not very keen on slum dwellers undertaking such self-redevelopment projects. So you know, so that is essentially the situation. And even though Jan Nijman was very optimistic when he wrote this essay, obviously it seemed to be a little too, it did not work out the way he had anticipated it would work out. But yeah, it's a good essay because it really helps us understand the concept of neoliberalism and what it means and why what is going on is different from the textbook version of neoliberalism. Although there is a lot of debate in the about this term neoliberalism, and a lot of people say neoliberalism is not essentially about just markets. It's about all of these multiple institutions and the way they kind of play a part. Almost essentially, the feature of neoliberalism is the constriction of the state rather than the expansion of the market, and that is essentially what is going on in Bombay. Whether you want to call it neoliberalism or something else, that is really a matter of terminology. Okay. Now, any questions? Hello? Did somebody share their screen or what happened? I think Yash got. Yeah. Okay. Any questions, guys? Yeah.
I wanted to ask. I've heard this term liberalization of the 92. So is it the same as neoliberalism? Is that related or it's something else?
It is related. It's a related term. See, the term liberalism comes from classical liberalism, which is a kind of enlightenment movement, where this is a long political theory class, so can't go into too much detail, but basically the idea is drawn from classical liberalism, where this was a time in the 17th and 18th century where states were essentially despotic states. We didn't have, and this is essentially Europe, so there were no democratic states in the modern sense of the term. These were centralized despotic states, and the kind of intellectuals at that time, the most progressive intellectuals, were talking about restricting the state's role so that it would liberate people from the kind of, the feudal system that existed at that time. And so it was an essentially anti-statist critique. But it belonged to a certain time, right? The reason why it is called neoliberalism is because it's new in the sense that it is a revival of these kind of older classical liberal ideas in a context where the society is very different. So most states where neoliberal reforms took place, especially in the Western world, or even in India for that matter, liberalization happened in a democratic society, where the state had a very important public role to play in terms of planning, in terms of welfare schemes, in terms of funding, in terms of public goods, and so on. And what liberalization or this neoliberalism was about basically carrying out reforms which would reduce the scope of the state in social affairs. So reduce the scope of the state in terms of providing housing or services or, running core industries or, many of the important enterprises, utilities, and so on. And therefore therefore became a kind of a way of promoting privatization of the economy, opening up markets to free trade, and so on. What that meant was that it would obviously remove many of the protections that people had from the capital system, and basically removed those protections, right? And that is the reason why liberalization in 92, also the 92, what happened in India was that there was a balance of payments crisis, which is basically the kind of loans that India owed to the IMF, right? And because India was defaulting on the loan, India was forced to undertake certain macroeconomic reforms, which is why it's called liberalization of the economy, which is what the critics call neoliberalism, right? So it's related terms, and it has to do with a certain kind of older classical liberal ideas which are reintroduced in a very kind of a narrow way, to justify the kind of reforms that we are seeing. Okay, any more questions or should we stop here? All right then. So next week, what are we reading? We are reading Parthasarathi and this guy. What's his name? Jonathan Anjaria. Okay, fair enough. Okay, guys. See you then next week. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.